He was publicly humiliated at a school meeting, escorted out under the approving eyes of those who saw his red MAGA hat as a symbol of division. No one had any idea that this man was the one who had single-handedly saved the school from shutting down with his donations. When the truth came out, the ones responsible found themselves at the center of a scandal they'd never forget. But to understand how it all unraveled, let's start from the beginning. Jonathan Ridley stepped confidently into the brightly lit school foyer, where a long table was set up for parent meeting registrations. The walls were decorated with cheerful posters about inclusion and respect, though the atmosphere in the room suggested something far less welcoming. Jonathan's signature red MAGA hat sat proudly on his head, as usual, a staple of his wardrobe that rarely went unnoticed. As he approached the registration table, a cluster of parents near the coffee stand began whispering. A few exchanged incredulous glances, while one mother hastily pulled out her phone, snapping a picture. Jonathan caught sight of her out of the corner of his eye. She smirked as her fingers danced across the screen, likely crafting a cutting caption for her post. One woman in a designer scarf made no effort to keep her voice down. "Is he serious? What kind of person shows up to a school event wearing that?" she sneered. "I mean, what's he even doing here?" Jonathan, used to such reactions, ignored the comment and moved forward with a polite nod to the volunteers at the table. But he couldn't help noticing the growing tension in the air. Every step seemed to amplify the buzz of murmurs. He adjusted his blazer, keeping his posture relaxed, as he scanned the room for familiar faces. Just as he was about to enter the auditorium, he was intercepted by a petite woman with sharp features and an air of authority. Miss Kinsley, the school principal, had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped in front of Jonathan, blocking his path. "Mr. Ridley?" she said, her voice strained but polite. "Could I have a quick word?" Jonathan stopped, raising an eyebrow. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Miss Kinsley gestured toward his hat, her smile faltering. "I wanted to suggest, perhaps, that you remove your hat. We try to keep things non-political here at Millwood Elementary. It's important to maintain a neutral environment for our parents and staff." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, studying her expression. "Non-political? It's just a hat," he replied evenly. "And isn't neutrality about respecting everyone's choices? I thought you taught the kids about tolerance here." The smile vanished completely. Her eyes narrowed, and her tone hardened. "Tolerance isn't about making statements that provoke others, Mr. Ridley. I'm asking you to reconsider, for the sake of the school community." Jonathan held her gaze, unflinching. "With all due respect, Miss Kinsley, I'm here to support the school, just like every other parent. If this is really about tolerance, maybe the lesson starts with us adults." The tension between them was palpable. Parents nearby pretended not to eavesdrop, but hung on every word. Miss Kinsley's jaw tightened. "If you refuse to cooperate, this could become a problem," she warned, her voice icy. Jonathan's lips curled into a calm, deliberate smile. He nodded slightly, as though conceding the point, and said with a quiet resolve, "Then let's see how you handle this problem." With that, he stepped past her into the auditorium, his hat still firmly in place, leaving the principal staring after him, her cheeks flushed with frustration. The school auditorium buzzed with the chatter of parents and staff as the meeting began. Miss Kinsley stood at the podium, her posture stiff with authority, while a slideshow of budget statistics flickered on the screen behind her. She cleared her throat, silencing the murmurs, and launched into her presentation. "Our school is facing significant budget challenges," she began, her voice crisp. "We need new textbooks, repairs for the gymnasium, and additional resources for our teachers. Unfortunately, current funding barely covers the essentials." The room grew quiet, the weight of her words sinking in. Jonathan, seated near the middle of the room, listened intently. As Miss Kinsley continued, he raised his hand, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the occasional sideways glance at his MAGA hat. Miss Kinsley hesitated when she noticed his hand, her eyes narrowing slightly. After a pause, she nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Mr. Ridley?" Jonathan stood, his voice measured but firm. "I'd like to offer my assistance. I believe I can help bridge some of the gaps in your budget." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Before he could elaborate, Miss Kinsley interrupted, her tone sharp and dismissive. "Thank you, Mr. Ridley, but I don't think that would be appropriate." Jonathan blinked, surprised. "I don't understand. I'm just trying to help." Miss Kinsley folded her arms, her expression hardening. "Your associations," she said, with a pointed glance at his hat, "could send the wrong message about our school's values. We can't afford to be linked to such divisive views." A smattering of applause broke out from a few parents in the audience, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some lowered their eyes, clearly uneasy with the exchange. Jonathan, remaining calm, addressed her directly. "Miss Kinsley, my offer has nothing to do with politics. This is about supporting the students and staff. Isn't that what matters?" But Miss Kinsley was unmoved. Her voice grew colder, the tension in the room palpable. "Perhaps you should consider how your choices impact the atmosphere of our school, Mr. Ridley." Jonathan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, she motioned to the back of the room. "Security!" she called, her tone clipped. "Please escort Mr. Ridley out. We need to maintain a respectful environment." Gasps echoed across the room as a burly security guard approached. Jonathan stood his ground, his expression calm but resolute. Before the guard could reach him, a small voice cut through the silence. "Dad!" Jonathan turned to see his son, Tommy, standing near the door. The boy's eyes brimmed with tears, his voice trembling as he pleaded, "Please don't leave." Jonathan knelt down, wrapping his arms around Tommy in a comforting hug. He looked his son in the eyes and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tommy, we're here to help the school, and nothing, no hat, no words, can change who we are or what we stand for." The room was utterly silent, save for the soft sniffles of the boy. Jonathan rose, still holding his son's hand, and turned to the security guard. "I'll leave," he said evenly. "But this school is supposed to teach tolerance and fairness. Maybe some of us need a reminder of what those words mean." The guard gently took Jonathan's arm and began to lead him toward the exit. As they walked, whispers broke out among the parents and staff. Some stared in shock, others avoided his gaze. The sound of murmurs and rustling papers filled the air as Jonathan left the auditorium, his head held high, while Tommy clung to his side. The next morning, Miss Kinsley strode into the teacher's lounge, her confidence radiating as she relayed the events of the previous evening to her colleagues. "I had to take control of the situation," she declared, a self-satisfied smile on her face. "That hat was a blatant provocation. I couldn't let it disrupt the meeting. I think the parents appreciated me stepping up." Several staff members nodded politely, though a few exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was clear that not everyone shared her enthusiasm for how the situation had been handled, but Miss Kinsley was too absorbed in her triumph to notice. Her moment of glory was abruptly interrupted by the shrill ring of her desk phone. She frowned, annoyed by the intrusion, and answered curtly. "Principal Kinsley." The voice on the other end was crisp and formal. "Miss Kinsley, this is Superintendent Graham. We need you to come to the district office immediately for a meeting regarding last night's incident. It's urgent." Miss Kinsley's smug demeanor faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Of course, I'll be there shortly," she replied, her tone firm. As she hung up the phone, a flicker of unease crossed her face, but she brushed it aside. When she arrived at the district office, her heels clicked sharply against the polished floors as she approached the conference room. Opening the door, she froze. Sitting at the large table were Superintendent Graham, several members of the school board, and to her shock, Jonathan Ridley, who was seated at the center. Jonathan's posture was relaxed, his signature calm smile playing on his lips. He greeted her with a polite nod. "Good morning, Miss Kinsley." The superintendent gestured for her to take a seat. As she sat down, her unease deepened. The room was tense, and all eyes were on her. "Miss Kinsley," the superintendent began, his voice measured. "We called this meeting to address a serious matter. It has come to our attention that there was an incident at last night's parent meeting involving Mr. Ridley." Miss Kinsley straightened, ready to defend herself. Yes, there was. Mr. Ridley's presence, along with his attire was causing discomfort among parents. I acted in the best interest of the school. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his expression still composed. Discomfort? He asked, his tone calm but pointed. I offered to help the school, Miss Kinsley. My attire had no bearing on my intention to contribute. The superintendent cleared his throat. Before we proceed further, let me make something very clear. Mr. Ridley is not just a parent. He is our district's largest donor. Miss Kinsley's face drained of color. Donor, she echoed, her voice faltering. Superintendent Graham nodded. Thanks to Mr. Ridley's generosity, we've been able to secure funding for critical campus improvements, including new technology, facility upgrades, and additional teacher resources. His contributions have been invaluable. Jonathan interjected, his tone polite but firm. I've always believed in investing in education, Superintendent. But I also believe that every parent and student deserves respect, regardless of their views. Miss Kinsley stammered, searching for an explanation. I didn't know. I thought... The superintendent raised a hand to silence her. Miss Kinsley, the board has reviewed footage from last night's meeting. He gestured toward a laptop at the end of the table. A staff member pressed play, and the room watched as the scene unfolded. Miss Kinsley publicly dismissing Jonathan, calling security, and the poignant moment with his son. The board members exchanged disapproving looks as the video ended. The superintendent's voice was firm. This behavior is unacceptable. Your actions were unprofessional and reflect poorly on the values we uphold as a district. Jonathan added, his tone steady but resolute. Miss Kinsley, I hold no ill will toward you, but this incident highlights a serious issue. Schools should be places of inclusion, not division. I hope we can learn from this. Miss Kinsley, visibly shaken, tried to muster a defense, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Her earlier confidence had crumbled, leaving her visibly humbled and deeply uneasy about what lay ahead. The school board meeting was held in the largest conference room in the district office, its walls lined with awards and plaques celebrating educational achievements. But the atmosphere inside was far from celebratory. The long, polished table was surrounded by serious faces. Board members, district officials, and a few community representatives. At the far end of the table sat Miss Kinsley, her usual air of authority replaced with visible tension. Jonathan Ridley was seated across from her, calm and composed as always, his presence commanding respect without the need for words. The superintendent began, his tone firm and deliberate. We are here to address the events of the recent parent meeting and the subsequent actions of Miss Kinsley. After reviewing all evidence, including video footage and witness statements, we must discuss the consequences of her behavior. Miss Kinsley sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent the entire night preparing her defense, but as she looked around the room, she realized she might be fighting a losing battle. One of the board members, an older woman with glasses perched at the tip of her nose, leaned forward. Miss Kinsley, she said, her voice sharp, this school is a place of learning, inclusion, and respect. Your actions during the meeting were not only inappropriate, but disgraceful. How do you justify publicly humiliating a parent who was offering to help? Miss Kinsley hesitated, then tried to muster her defense. I believed I was acting in the best interest of the school. The situation could have escalated. His attire was causing discomfort among other parents. A younger board member interjected, his voice filled with controlled frustration. Discomfort? That's your justification? This isn't about a hat, Miss Kinsley. It's about your inability to separate personal bias from your professional responsibilities. Schools are not arenas for political agendas or personal vendettas. Another member, a retired teacher with a reputation for fairness, spoke next. Your job is to foster a supportive environment for every family, regardless of their beliefs. This incident has damaged the school's reputation and alienated a key supporter of our district. It cannot go unanswered. Miss Kinsley's face grew pale, her carefully rehearsed arguments crumbling under the weight of their criticism. The superintendent looked at her directly. Miss Kinsley, your actions reflect poorly on this district. We have no choice but to remove you from your position as principal, effective immediately. A heavy silence fell over the room. Miss Kinsley's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. She slumped slightly in her chair, her confidence shattered. Jonathan, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. I didn't come here today seeking punishment or retribution. I believe in education and the values it represents: respect, tolerance, and understanding. What happened at that meeting was a failure of those values, but it's also an opportunity to learn and grow. He paused, scanning the room. Being tolerant means respecting those who think differently. That's a lesson we need to teach our children, and it starts with us. The board members nodded in agreement, and a few even murmured their approval. As the meeting adjourned, the superintendent turned to Jonathan. Mr. Ridley, on behalf of the district, I want to extend our gratitude for your contributions to our schools. We are truly fortunate to have your support. The next day, Jonathan attended another parent meeting at the school. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different. As he entered the room, parents and staff broke into applause. Some even stood, offering handshakes and smiles. Jonathan's son Tommy beamed with pride as he stood by his father's side. Jonathan took a seat at the front, and when the room quieted, he addressed the group. I want to thank you all for the warm welcome. My family and I care deeply about this school and this community. Let's work together to make it a place where every child feels supported and valued. He ended with a smile. And remember, respect isn't about agreeing on everything. It's about listening, understanding, and treating each other with dignity, even when we disagree. I hope that's a lesson we can all carry forward. The applause that followed was thunderous, a clear acknowledgement of the respect he had earned. Jonathan left the meeting knowing that justice had been served, not just for him, but for the values he stood for.